Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Joe Rogan Paradox, Joking in All Seriousness. Comedians in a Circle Dance. Their entire effort goes into a regurgitation of the fashionable ethical universals to enhance their transcendently important public standing, and to ingratiate themselves with an anonymous audience. Nataza Kovacevic. He doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, but he can't live without applause. It's his alcohol and nicotine. How thrilled he was at the new chance to pull at people's heartstrings. He spoke about those awful judicial murders with such emotion that people all but wept. I could tell how much he enjoyed his indignation, and I hated him. Milan Kundera, The Joke. Well, hi everybody, and today I'm just finishing off, or I hope this will be the final video. You could call it the Joe Rogan trilogy. But I'm only going to talk about the Joe Rogan issues at the start of the video, and then rather than go into the he said this, he said that, and all the different arguments that have gone on between different personalities in the podcast world over the last few weeks, I wanted to bring out more perennial, longer-lasting issues. So after the initial discussion of recent Joe Rogan relevant material, if you're not really into the podcasting world, please don't worry, because shortly afterwards, the majority of this video is about how, without getting into the nitty-gritty, you can place against the podcast world the work of Milan Kundera and some of the things he said about the way in which media is different from what's involved in reading a novel. And I think there are some fascinating insights that get lost amongst all the noise about people online discussing podcast issues. So just a quick recap. I've done a couple of videos that related initially to the top two people here, Dave Smith and Douglas Murray, who had quite a viral spat, argument, debate, however you want to phrase it, on the Joe Rogan show. And I think currently Joe Rogan's just under about 20 million followers as of April 2025. And down below, there's Joe Rogan talking with another comedian. And the issue about comedians is something I'm going to pick up on. The importance that a lot of the podcast world on serious issues ironically involves a lot of comedian commentators, whether ex-comedians or current comedians or a combination of both. Now, Tim Dillon is the figure in the corner, and he was on Joe Rogan very, very recently, and he made a joke, or he says he developed this new idea, purportedly new, the notion of war tourism. So he took an idea that was said by Douglas Murray and has been picked on by countless people. The idea, in its initial context, Douglas Murray was saying, as a journalist, or as someone who's going to talk about a particular topic in detail and for a long period of time, it's ideally you would want to go to the area you're talking about. So Tim Dillon takes this idea, and along with Joe Rogan, they make fun of the idea of war tourism and the notion that you have to go somewhere, or you should go somewhere to witness something. And that's an interesting elision I've just made. It's been widely interpreted that Douglas Murray was saying you have to go. He wasn't saying that. He was saying in an ideal world, if you followed good journalistic ethics, you would always try to. But anyway, I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty, but just recently there's been this fun made about the notion of war tourism. So the idea, Tim Dillon there's a segment a clip I've put in the description section, where Tim Dillon runs with this idea that we could all go off for an hour or two and witness wars at first hand to give us some experience. Now, just to repeat, whatever tribe you're on, I want to try and go beyond that. So there'll be people in favour of Tim Dillon, there'll be massive defenders of Dave Smith, there will be pro and anti Douglas Murray. Joe Rogan's got the whole podcast world sewn up. he doesn't have to worry about his popularity. But I want to try and point out in various ways in what follows that some of the debates are a consequence of comedians doing what comedians do well. They're comics, they're not logicians. And also, the nature of the podcast medium is very, very different to past values based upon the written word in terms of book-based literacy. And the backing to all of this is the author I've looked at in the previous two videos, Milan Kundera, who was from communist Czechoslovakia, emigrated and ended up living the rest of his life in France. And he wrote extensively various novels, but also he wrote very eloquently about the place of the novel itself. He wrote non-fiction about the importance of the novel. And just to put it out there, his claim was that the novel and European culture was dying because the novel and what backed up the novel, poetry, all these things, was no longer important in a mass media society, and the values of the novel were undermined in a mass media society. So that's the context. I'm just trying to ask you to think of all the debates online with Joe Rogan, or if you're not interested in online podcasting politics, just to think of living in a mass media society that's moved beyond nowadays legacy media. And we're now living in an era where podcasts, Spotify, Instagram, TikTok, even Facebook, there are all these different avenues in which people are in contact with each other online that aren't legacy media, and definitely aren't what goes into the act and the pastime of reading novels. So without more ado, I just want to dive in and look at some of these issues. So this was, "You should go there," is what Douglas Murray basically said, and it's in the initial debate to this comedian Dave Smith. If you're going to talk about Israel, Gaza, he acted very shocked, and his apparent pomposity, which I'll talk about in a second, seemed to offend a lot of people. So he basically said, "Haven't you been there?" And I've mentioned Tim Dillon recently has been making fun of this notion of war tourism. So the first thing I'd emphasize is the "if." So I've italicized it and put it in a bigger font. If you're going to keep talking about something, and you're going to talk about something for a long length of time, Douglas Murray was not saying there is any freedom of speech issue. People aren't allowed to talk about what they're allowed to, whatever they want to. It wasn't about allowing people. It was more, the point I think he was trying to make was, if you're going to talk about a particular topic at length, in detail, for an extended period of time, in an ideal world, you'll know something firsthand about the area you're talking about. So that, I would argue, has been passed over. Everyone's simplifying drastically what he said. And part of that goes to, I will argue, what comics do automatically. To be fair to comedians, that their whole job, this will surprise you, is to be funny. And the humour they produce is often based upon deliberate misreadings of logical statements, emphasising things in unusual ways. But it shouldn't be a shock to most people that the prime motivation for comedy and the prime responsibility of comedy is not to be factually or logically accurate. Often it's juxtaposing odd ideas that don't make sense and seeing where they go, and all these comic effects you can achieve that have very little to do with logical, coherent argument. And what I want to ask you to think about is the way in which the type of qualities that make comedy great, when comedians talk about serious issues, irrespective of how factually correct they are, the way in which they argue about those facts can't help but be affected by, A, the format of podcasting, which emphasises personality, which emphasises how you speak, which emphasises tone of voice, all these things, and the fact, because they're comedians, they often make jokes. And all of this builds to a way in which, as I'll develop later, it's a Marshall McLuhan idea, the medium is the message. the actual content of what's being said is pretty much subordinated and played down in favour of how what's being said suits the format in which it's being presented. So the format and the medium, your computer screen or however you're consuming online material, that actually tends to dominate more than the content of what's being said. Now, how that affects logical argument, I would suggest, is there are various ways in which now people are speaking authoritatively about the notion of experience. So along the lines of if you're going to keep talking about something, ideally you should have some direct experience. I'm not going to argue that in each and every case that always necessarily has to be true. But I want to give you the example of James Lindsay, who, if you're not aware of him, is quite a media figure these days, and he has built his career on arguing that the universities and various institutions in Western democracies have been taken over by woke activists. Critical pedagogy is one of his arguments, that there is a strand of neo-Marxism that took over the long, slow cultural Marxist route into our institutions. And he talks a lot about how the universities have been affected by all this. Now, this goes directly to the issue of Douglas Murray's point. Ideally, you should go somewhere. So I came from the university sector. I spent decades, my whole career there. And I can tell you that, yes, some of the universities might come across to some people like left-wing madrasas. They may seem ideologically captured. But in the way in which universities, on a day-to-day basis, increasingly lowered their standards and became almost divorced from reality, a lot of that had a structural basis in the commercialization of universities, the way in which teaching was rearranged, the way in which student standards have gone down because they're trying to make money rather than just educate people. There are a whole lot of reasons. And I've put this here, the Jehovah Witness notion of causality. What I'm trying to explain is that James Lindsay and others talking about how the universities have declined, not having directly experienced decades of working in them. So I have first-hand experience. And they saying that the decline of the universities is due to cultural Marxists, I'm suggesting is a bit like when there's a blood shortage in the medical community, when people haven't given enough blood, you sometimes get drives to get people to donate more. I'd make the analogy, when there's a shortage of blood for medical purposes, it's like blaming the Jehovah's Witnesses who don't give blood for the shortage. There may be some tangential or tiny, it may not be true that, if more Jehovah's Witnesses gave blood, then the situation would be infinitesimally better. But the idea that there's a direct causality, that Jehovah's Witnesses are to blame, is nonsense. And likewise, if you don't have direct experience, very odd stories tend to develop, and I've heard it repeated back to me almost word for word, the type of James Lindsay argument. In public discussions I've had, people have told me what's been happening in the universities, and I just know from first hand it's not true. And I'm speaking as someone who shares their criticism of what's happened to the universities, but I'm just completely rejecting their analysis of the cause. And if you don't know the cause, I don't think the universities are salvageable now. But even if if you were ever going to save the universities, you have to know the cause, and it's all being muddied. So apologies for going into that in a bit of depth. But why I mention that is, I think it's an aspect, the needing to go somewhere or needing to have direct experience. That is an aspect of the current controversy in the podcasting world, this big debate about what constitutes an expert, or the nature of lived experience, that horrible phrase which I'll talk about in a second. But I think that's crucial. And all I can say is from my own, to talk about what I know just both viscerally and having observed it for decades. I've seen how stories, canards, accepted ways of speaking that aren't true propagate. And in Milan Kundera's terminology, I'm going to refer to this as the notion of kitsch. So I'll go into that in more depth. But part of this is, I said, this horrible phrase, lived experience. I'd suggest that in the past, that was what people on a certain type of ideologically captured person would often say. You can't argue with me because you don't share my lived experience. And it's a way of shutting down debate. Now, my point is slightly nuanced. I'm going to suggest that in some senses, lived experience is important. For example, the reasons I've just given for why I think the vast majority of analyses of the university sector have been completely wrong. People are talking without enough direct experience. And I think this was Douglas Murray's criticism of Dave Smith, is based on the same lines. But be that as it may, this notion of lived experience, whilst on the one hand it was hijacked by people using it as an excuse not to engage with people who have valid arguments but don't necessarily have direct experience of various parts of life. That's true, that can happen. So, for example, I'll try not to make this polemical or controversial, but I don't think men should be excluded from all debates about women's issues in society. Men and women coexist in a society, and I think to some extent they should each have a say in society, even if some of those issues impinge disproportionately on the other sex. But that is not the same as to say that men can speak authoritatively about what it is to be a woman. So the idea that men who've never had a period, men who've never been through the menopause, men who've never given birth, I think it's an absolute joke that men could claim at a certain level to be able to speak about what it's like to be a woman. So lived experience can matter. And in other instances, when the discussion or debate is more abstract and logical, lived experience doesn't matter as much. So I hope most people would agree that up until this point, all I'm trying to say is something quite banal in a way, that lived experience can be essential, but depending on the context, in other cases, not so much. But the way in which it's being discussed in the podcasting world on the back of Douglas Murray's notion of you need to go somewhere, or you should go somewhere, it's been simplified beyond all recognition and caricatured and made fun of, and it can be funny. I think Douglas Murray came across to a lot of people as incredibly pompous, so they're quite happy to see him made fun of. But I also think it makes fun of the serious point behind what he was saying, and, that's not so ideal. And one aspect about the expert issue that loads of people have picked up on, why should Douglas Murray claim expertise, or why should Douglas Murray promote debate should only happen with experts? Again, he wasn't actually saying that. He was saying when you have keen amateurs or people with non-mainstream academic views, once in a while, as often as possible perhaps, their argument should be counterbalanced with the state-of-the-art knowledge and an academic discipline. Now, one of the reasons that doesn't tend to happen is it's not always clickbait. It's not always that interesting to have the dry, dull facts presented by academics, as I'm probably proving now. Although I'm not claiming I'm presenting facts, I am presenting an argument. But this idea that experts, especially in recent years when they've been discredited in certain areas, does that mean you never listen to experts? And I'm suggesting that one of, I think, the mischaracterizations of the whole debate is that Joe Rogan, Tom Dillon, Dave Smith are experts in a way with microphones. And that's a very underestimated aspect of what they do. They're not gauche, naive people who know nothing. They may not be experts in the area they often choose to speak about, especially someone like Dave Smith, who moves between being a comedian and talking passionately about politics he's interested in. But all of them are experts using a microphone. It's no coincidence they have absolutely massive numbers of followers. And I just don't think that's insignificant. This idea that it's welcome to the world of non-experts. They are experts, just in a different form, is one thing to think about. And it reminds me, I think this is a beautiful quote by Marshall McLuhan when he says, "For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind." And why that's so crucial to the debate I'm talking about that's hit the podcast world recently is that I think people are fixating, quite understandably, on who said what and how it was said. And actually, it's not really about the content of what's being said. It's not really about the political issues. There's a whole way in which the content, the political arguments are overwhelmingly overdetermined by the nature in which they're spoken, the podcast format, the personalities of the people involved. And we think we're focusing on the content of what's said, but actually that acts, in McLuhan's words, as the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. And the rest of this video is all about how a writer like Milan Kundera describes how this process can work and what's being lost. So he would argue reading a good literary novel is much more reflexive, contemplative, and this being distracted by the juicy piece of meat isn't as much of a factor, because a lot of literary fiction actually, in the act of making you read, is asking you to consider and to reflect upon how you're being told the story. Narratives tend to reflect upon themselves in lots of subtle ways. Whereas when you're watching a podcast, because it's filmed, because they're real people, you tend not to notice how the format is actually affecting the content that's contained within the podcast. Like I say, with novels, that tends not to happen. The way in which the novel is affecting you tends to be a much more explicit part of the process. And Milan Kundera has this notion coming from the communist Czechoslovakia. He calls it a circle dance. Or I think in other parts of his work it's translated as dancing in a ring. But it's linked to his notion of kitsch, which I'll explore very, very shortly. But this idea of a commonly held but untrue sentiment, or a way of thinking of the world that's kitsch, it tends to be mass-produced, it tends to be overly sentimental, it tends to be superficial. And arguably, and he uses the notion of a circle dance. So if you think of like a folk dance, where everyone's in a circle, all moving in and then out at the same time, he uses that as an analogy because everyone feels good, everyone feels part of a community, everyone feels like they all belong, unless you've been kicked out of the circle. And he uses that as an analogy to describe the ideology that takes place in mass media, or in a communist society where there's a dominant ideology. And there's another paradox. I mentioned paradox in the title of this talk, but there's a paradox in sectors of the online world devoted to the idea that they're a counterweight to legacy media. They're providing alternative forums for people who aren't experts to speak. There is this ideological conformity sometimes that comes from that. There's unwritten rules of how a podcast should go. There are tribes of people in huge numbers supporting particular figures. And arguably this can create ideological conformity that isn't often acknowledged as such. So if you lived in communist Czechoslovakia, you know what the dominant ideology is because it's rammed down your throat every day. I think one of Milan Kundera's points is, in the developed West, with supposedly free forms of media, whether they be legacy media or new podcast type forms, I think we overestimate the extent to which we have genuine freedom of expression or thought. And then this idea of the concept of only joking. the idea, it goes straight to this notion of comedians talking about politics. And I think Douglas Murray referred to it, he got frustrated trying to talk to Joe Rogan and Dave Smith, particularly Dave Smith, and he said it's like punching jelly, because when I call you out, you just say you're a comedian, but you also talk about serious issues. And that's an ongoing debate. I'm not saying Douglas Murray completely won that issue, but there does seem to be this, especially with Tim Dillon and Joe Rogan's chats, they're always joking, but they're simultaneously talking about serious issues. So it begs the question, when is it serious and when is it only a joke? And what happens when podcast talks about serious issues are disproportionately weighted to this paradoxical, simultaneous, weird thing where they're serious topics but jokingly discussed? And what effect does jokingly discussing things have on serious topics? So if podcasts with comedians on are always talking about funny things, or only ever saying we're making fun of serious topics, there isn't so much of an issue. But when serious topics become understood through various forms of comedy that then it almost like infiltrate how the vast majority of people understand those issues, that's got potentially quite significant issues. And I think Douglas Murray was clumsily at times. Who am I to say he's been clumsy? But I don't think he fully managed to express that. But that's what he was alluding to, and that's what he was concerned about. And I don't think that ever really registered or tends to be overlooked in the debates on these topics. But this is in the novel Milan Kundera. He has this joke. The whole where the novel gets its title from is this is a postcard this guy Ludwig sends to his girlfriend at the time, and she's very serious and she's an ideologically captured member of the Communist Party, and she's off at some communist camp, training ideology type education camp, and just to try and be funny, he sends her this postcard that's a parody of communist values. Optimism is the opium of the people. A healthy atmosphere stinks of stupidity. Long live Trotsky, Ludwig. And that's the postcard. And I won't bore you with the whole plot of the novel, but he's kicked out the Communist Party because this joke of a postcard is taken seriously. So this is an example of trying to make fun of the established ideology and it basically ruining someone's life. And in today's terms, there's plenty of comedians who've actually fallen on the wrong side of accepted ideology. In the UK, for example, it tends to be right-wing comedians have actually been cancelled left, right and centre by mainstream ideological comedy values, if that makes sense. So we're not, in the West, I'd argue, so far away from communist Czechoslovakia as we might like to think. And then this was just very recently Joe Rogan talking to Tim Dillon. And I won't impersonate Joe Rogan because he tries to impersonate Douglas Murray's English accent. And sorry, Joe, but it's an awful interpretation. So for me to interpret an American's awful interpretation of a very posh English accent when I'm not posh either is a recipe for disaster. But Joe Rogan says, he's mocking Douglas Murray, says, have you been there? Have you even... You haven't been? And he's playing on this concept of, you know, in an ideal world, if you want to be a serious journalist, you should go somewhere. But obviously using it for comic effect. And then this is someone who just, I'll pick out, Jason Cox made comments in my comment section of this channel. And I just really liked he's using humour in yet a different way again. Since when has I think you're talking bollocks been an opinion beyond the pale of freedom of speech? He should be lashed to a chair and made to listen to flat earthers till he repents. Don't talk about camel riding till you've ridden one. It wasn't about whether you like camels, FFS. So I don't think Jason was necessarily trying to be funny, but I just found this funny. And to be give total context, this wasn't actually about, it was about the Joe Rogan topic, but the he there was about somebody else I was having a public debate with. But I think it applies to Joe Rogan. But this idea of don't talk about camel riding till you've ridden one, and it's not about whether you actually like camels. That's another example of how you can use comedy to present the opposite to Joe Rogan's point of view. So I'm emphasizing how comedy isn't useless in emphasizing logical points, but it can also cut both ways. But I just think those three types of humour, the first one is in a communist regime trying to poke fun at an absolutely dominant ideology. The second one by Joe Rogan, you may or may not think it's funny if you watch the video, but I would argue he's actually misrepresenting what was actually said. So he's undermining the factual or the genuine intent of a comment for comedic effect. And then the third one is frustration from Jason at how the whole debate went that has an inadvertently or deliberate, I'm not quite sure, but for me, it has a definite comedic effect, the way he expresses himself about it. And then I'm going to quote again, I think this is the first and I don't know, maybe the last time, but I want to quote some of Jason's comments that he then went on to make, because actually it made me think about, I don't want to give a totally negative interpretation along the lines of only great literature or only great novels can express serious thoughts, and the online forums and the online comment section and online discussion platforms have no purpose or role. Because I think, for whatever word skills I have, I don't think I could have put it as well as Jason does in this section here. So he's talking about the whole debate at the moment in the podcasting world. Isn't the mass becoming a kind of elite by pure mass of weight? So he's talking, for example, about Joe Rogan's 20 million followers. What is on the grapevine is the most popular, and what is in the shops is the most bought. We can't say the most meritorious food is stocked. I found the Murray debate curious. The irony of those gunning at Murray for elitism, when Rogan could have said the same and been more readily heard with less offence taken. The transmitter is more important than the transmission. I'm the one who's emphasised that, because that's like McLuhan's The Medium is the message. That the imagined pomposity of Murray's voice leaked into the imagined pomposity of his ideas to the point where he could not be heard, and the actual pomposity or lack of it gauged, which I think is a brilliant point. That this is the role of personality and people's projections onto. So if you were reading a transcript, you wouldn't have the same response. It was Douglas Murray's vocal mannerisms, the way he presented himself. This had a disproportionate effect. The obvious merit of merit is undone by, but we are the ordinary and we have a right to speak gibberish devoid of merit. Nearly as good as my dad was a toolmaker, which for non-British readers is a comment that our current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, makes. He was made fun of because he constantly refers to the fact his father was a toolmaker. In other words, a horny-handed son of industry, when in fact he himself is a human rights barrister and very, very middle class indeed. Anyway, a bit ominous really, when it seems like it would take a despised elitist to recalibrate any sense barometer. Also suspicious that the whole thumbs up likes are a weird education and mediocrity. So Jason's making various points here, but the idea is that the despised elitist, i.e. Douglas Murray, he's trying to recalibrate the sense barometer. And the problem is, because he's perceived as part of a despised elite, the message isn't getting through. And I think that goes to what Jason's saying about the when Rogan could have said the same thing and been more readily heard with less offence taken. It was my earlier point being made about the juicy piece of meat, the content. People aren't listening to the content. People are over-interpreting the way in which the content is presented, and their responses are over-determined. They're affected overly so by the personalities of the people involved, which is fine. That's why people watch podcasts. Podcasts are entertaining. Podcasts aren't like reading a dry, dusty book. But I also think people need to be aware of this idea that Jason finishes with. The thumbs up likes are a weird education and mediocrity. You could argue that that is, the medium is the message. Podcasting is a forum for promoting mediocrity. So now I just want to, what I'm going to do is refer to quite a bit of Milan Kundera's work, but break things up from now on with, as I've done before, I'm going to show various pieces of art in between the quotations, so it's not quotation after quotation. And as I've said before in other videos, I think there's some personal association I make between the text and the subsequent image. You may not. They're just personal associations, like a Rorschach inkblot test. I hope you see some of the links, but if you don't, the worst is you've got to see some good art, interesting art, in the middle of quotation, so it's not just quotation after quotation. So some of Kundera's key themes that I think go directly to my whole previous discussion about where the podcast debate has gone so far. So I love this definition of kitsch as a notion of a sentimental group lie. So I think sentimentality, this goes to the very first two epigraphs at the very beginning of this talk. Not so much Joe Rogan or Tim Dillon, but definitely Dave Smith. They use sentimentality and the morality that they have, and the implication is their opponents lack a similar level of heartfelt morality. So that's one aspect that Kundera talks about, particularly in his novel Slowness. He describes a character that reminds me very much of Dave Smith. And then the notion of ambiguity. Novels, Kundera argues, are good novels, good literary novels, are absolutely premised upon the essential aspects of ambiguity. And I don't think it's a coincidence. In a lot of Kundera novels, he splices contrasting authorial voices. So there are different points of view from different characters in quite a few of his novels, all interspliced amongst each other, so that you're never getting just one unambiguous point of view. And that's what novels are great at doing, showing that reality is interpreted by different people in different ways, which is a very obvious point to make. But again, in the podcast world, there's the danger. We're all in our tribes. We're all watching the people we're preordained to agree with. And the ambiguity, the different perspectives gets lost often. So I've introduced the concept of circle dancing. So I'm going to present you with a series of images that I think illustrate the concept of circle dancing. And what I've just said about the notion of a novel's ability to deal with ambiguity, Kundera in more than one place in his writings refers to this as the wisdom of the novel. And I would argue the wisdom of the novel stands against the entertainment value of the podcast. The wisdom of the novel may not be as entertaining, it may not be as clickbaity, and that's probably why the novel is dying out. But I think we're losing something quite significant. And Kundera, it's a major theme in his work, what's being lost. So he wrote a novel called Slowness, and slowness is an obvious theme. And he makes the point that the novel, and often what the novel is describing, is a form of contemplation. It's a pace of life that isn't the same pace as online activity that's quite frantic, changing from topic to topic, worried that you're going to lose the viewer, the need for clickbaits, the need for likes, all these fragmented aspects that are all about speed. And in his book, Slowness, there's reference to, I'll mention it in a second, but there's reference to a novel from 1777, I think it was, called No Tomorrow, a French novel from the 1700s. And it's a bit like Dangerous Liaison's novel. It's all about trysts and extramarital affairs, but it's all about delaying gratification, and it's all about not telling anyone about it. It's the joy of secrecy. Whereas compare that with, I did a previous video on Bop House and Baudrillard and referred to Lily Phillips and the idea that the exposure, everything is done in the public gaze nowadays. It's a completely different value system to what Kundera's describing in Slowness. And then Kundera did a novel called The Joke, which I've mentioned earlier. But ultimately, it's quite like a meta-reflection about what is humour. The joke behind the novel called The Joke, according to Kundera himself, is that by the end of the novel, the man trying to get revenge on somebody, it completely backfires and fails. And what his revenge that fuels all his actions in the novel initially are proved to be trivial. And everything that mattered to him, it's like a bit as you grow older, things that you thought were absolutely essential when you were younger seem as you get older to be increasingly trivial, and you think, why did I ever worry about that? So that's the notion of the joke, and that to refer back to the comedians in the podcasting world. Maybe ultimately the joke is on them to the extent that, successful as they are, all they're going to achieve is a world of triviality. When in some senses, it strikes me that the Joe Rogans of this world want to talk about serious things, but they're simultaneously hidebound by this overwhelming need to make everything trivial also. So, quite a cleft stick they're in. So in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, his most famous novel probably, I love this definition of kitsch. Kitsch causes two tears to flow in quick succession. The first tear says, how nice to see children running on the grass. The second tear says, how nice to be moved, together with all mankind, by children running on the grass. It's the second tier that makes kitsch kitsch. So Kundera's saying that's the type of thing that the communist government in Czechoslovakia would do. You take a basically pleasant thing like children playing on the grass and you turn it into political kitsch. Or this is a very quick summary. Oscar Wilde, a man must have a heart of stone not to laugh at the death of Little Nell. So Little Nell is a character from The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. And she dies. It's years since I read it, but it seems. He used to do public talks, and I think that influenced how he wrote it. But it takes a long time for Little Nell to finally croak it. And it's so melodramatic, because obviously Victorian tastes were quite melodramatic. But Oscar Wilde's just poking fun at how kitschy. For someone who could be a great writer, I'd suggest The Endless Death of Little Nell is not Dickens's finest moment. So Slowness, the point de l'endemain, is No Tomorrow in French. And that's the novel I was referring to earlier that's interspliced in the novel Slowness. And in the novel Slowness by Kundera, he's, as the name Slowness would imply, he's constantly contrasting quick jokes versus contemplation and accuracy. These are the values I'd suggest that stand in opposition to each other. And the problem with jokes is, the problem isn't that they're funny. You don't want to live a humorless life. But the vast majority of jokes start with false premises. And I've seen, I think it was Bill Burr was making jokes about the fires a few months ago in California. He was making jokes about the right-wing interpretations that homeless people started them or something. And he made a series of jokes for political purposes about the wildfires. And from a purely logical, if you're having a debate, the points he made didn't make sense. But that gets lost in the fact Bill Burr can be very funny. So the truth content of his statements might be approaching zero, but that's completely irrelevant because he's being funny. But again, it's when comedians drift into the world of politics. You don't want a world when politicians and political ideas can't be made fun of. But there's also, do you want genuine politics to be reduced just to trivial comedy also? It's, it's a debate to be had. So in the book Slowness, Kundera contrasts quite sharply this constant need, in podcasting terms, the exposure of people's personality when they're involved in podcast discussions. The minutiae of everything they've said has been combed over by different tribes on the internet. It's not about the contemplation or the reflection in the novel form. And then to give you a very quick example, this notion of, I think Kundera often writes about the idea of post-literacy, which is a favourite theme of mine. But even in, so I'll just quickly mention universities, and a lot of people maybe aren't interested, but if you're going to doubt the idea that literacy is under threat, universities over the last few decades have drastically reduced the way in which courses are taught. So when I went to university, you would learn a particular subject over a year, an academic year's worth of teaching. Now they're called modules, and you get broken up into short semesters, and things get taught in bite-sized chunks. And the difference being, if you're taught over a 9-month academic year, you can be told to go away and read long books because you have the time factor. When everything's chopped into semesters and modules, that's just not possible. And then in regular debates about universities, I've often come across this idea that art students or humanities students only have, say, 6 or 7 hours taught time a week. And this is used as evidence. Isn't this horrific? Well, no, if university courses were taught the way they used to be, when someone like me would give a lecture, you're referring to long book after book after book. And the idea is the student will have spent all week in the library reading that material so they could make sense of your lecture. So for 6 taught hours, the student should spend the whole week in the library. But that's almost laughable to think that ever goes on anymore. But anyway, I like this quote from the actual book Slowness. From Kundera. There is a Czech proverb that describes easy indolence by a metaphor. They are gazing at God's windows. A person gazing at God's windows is not bored. He is happy. In our world, indolence has turned into having nothing to do, which is a completely different thing. A person with nothing to do is frustrated, bored, is constantly searching for the activity he lacks. So the easy indolence is described by this metaphor. They are gazing at God's windows. And I think I've said throughout this channel and given you practical examples from art, gazing at God's windows, I would suggest, is looking at great art, which we'll do very shortly. And then this is an essay Kundera did on Kafka. There are tendencies in modern history that produce the Kafkan. So he doesn't use the adjective Kafkaesque. Kundera refers to the notion of something being Kafkan. So there are tendencies in modern history that produce the Kafkan in the broad social dimension. The progressive concentration of power, tending to deify itself. The bureaucratization of social activity that turns all institutions into boundless labyrinths, and the resulting depersonalization of the individual. And I've described the labyrinth as being a theme on this channel that I intend to return to. But the resulting depersonalization of the individual. Totalitarian states, as extreme concentrations of these tendencies, have brought out the close relationship between Kafka's novels and real life. But if in the West people are unable to see this relationship, it is not only because the society that we call democratic is less Kafkan than that of today's Prague. It is also, it seems to me, because over here the sense of the real is inexorably being lost. So we're going to start looking at actual art now, but I think, to summarise what Kundera is saying here, in novels or short stories like Kafka produced, and as Kundera lived through communist Czechoslovakian experience, it's easy to see when your life's controlled by a totalitarian government. I think Kundera is suggesting it's not so easy, even though those tendencies still actually may exist in the West. You don't tend to see them because we live in a place where the sense of the real is inexorably being lost. So the types of thought control, the types of determination of how we think is taking place in the abstract world of the internet, the non-real. Community bonds are broken down a lot more. So we're not interacting in person, but this sense of the real is inexorably being lost. So that's all been a lot of words so far, so now I'm breaking everything up with some images, hopefully in time to still keep your attention. Sorry, pressed the wrong button. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. But this idea of losing a sense of reality, I think it's alienation and anomie and existential angst are all themes in Edward Hopper. But I just love the way the lights recede endlessly into this blackness and the implied loneliness of this woman. In fact, the society we call democratic is also familiar with the process that bureaucratizes and depersonalizes. The entire planet has become a theatre of this process. So that's what I'd describe as the internet's effect. Kafka's novels are only an imaginary, oniric hyperbole of it. So oniric refers to the dream worlds. A totalitarian state is a prosaic and material hyperbole of it. So what he's saying is, Kafka's novels and short stories have a dreamlike, exaggerated quality, whereas totalitarian states are much more material, in your face, as the common phrase would put it. But they share some similar qualities, and I'd argue the modern online world has more of the Kafka quality. Kundera employed the metaphor of dancing in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting to portray conformism, conviction, and angelic innocence as dancing in the gigantic ring of like-minded people. So that's the analogy of the conformity of the ideological online world in which people tend to get into their own dancing ring. Joe Rogan has his supporters, Douglas Murray has his, and round we all dance. So you can think of the novel as reverse kitsch or as an antidote for kitsch. which I think is a common theme in Kundera's work. So for Kundera, the novel is an aggressive complexity, a kitsch destroyer. Remember, kitsch being defined as a sentimental group lie. It is precisely rebelliously intelligent, and I love this phrase, a Boston Tea Party of a genre, a defiance against the taxation of ideological absolutisms. So when you're getting annoyed with Douglas Murray, think of the novel as a Boston Tea Party. A defiance against the taxation of ideological absolutisms, a serious mischief of both conceptual and formal complication. It is ethical to the degree that it represents an axiological gadfly, to the degree that its aesthetics disorientate and buzz. And I'm sure you're all thinking that must have been the title. How could it have been called anything else? The only escape from the congealed political kitsch of the regime is into the lightness of total irresponsibility. Kundera shows how the regime corrupts totally the private consciousness of the citizens. And this is more frightening and more desolating than the more simple-minded way, for it was not based upon his own actual experience, in which Orwell had seen opposition to Big Brother being inexorably destroyed until every dissident had learned to love Big Brother. That is a naive prediction of what happened. Excuse me. So, apologies to anyone who's a massive fan of George Orwell's 1984, but Kundera is suggesting that actually, to some extent, whilst Orwell portrayed the brainwashing aspect of living in a totalitarian regime, Kundera's direct experience, his lived experience, if I can go back to that phrase, is actually different. The idea that the regime corrupts totally the private consciousness of the citizens. What really happens is, for Kundera, less dramatic, more depressingly banal. Communism in practice cannot conquer the private life, but it makes it light and meaningless, weightless and cynical, hence the unbearable lightness of being. This is the final damnation of a frozen ideology. It destroys the instinctive and almost unconscious decencies and weighty rhythms which men and women have always lived by. I think I understand them. They have the impression that the circle they are describing on the ground is a magical circle, uniting them like a ring, and their chests swell with an intense feeling of innocence. They are united not by marching like soldiers or fascist formations, but by dancing like children. What they are trying to spit in the cops' faces is their innocence. And I think that has more than passing relevance to some of the recent protests on university campuses. All politicians nowadays have a bit of the dancer in them, and all dancers are involved in politics, which, however, should not lead us to mistake the one for the other. The dancer differs from the politician in that he seeks not power but glory. His desire is not to impose this or that social scheme on the world. He couldn't care less about that, but to take over the stage so as to beam forth his self. Taking over the stage requires keeping other people off it, which supposes special battle tactics. The battle the dancer fights, moral judo. The dancer throws down the gauntlet to the whole world. Who can appear more moral, more courageous, more decent, more sincere, more self-sacrificing, more truthful than he? And he utilises every hold that lets him put the other person in a morally inferior situation. And I've seen in recent debates people do exactly this by arguing their concern, their moral outrage at the death of innocent babies is greater than anybody else's. Just to go back, so the moral judo of making yourself appear the most decent, the most sincere. In addition to that wonderful painting, it always also reminded me of the following actual photograph. Circle dancing is magic. It speaks to us through the millennia from the depths of human memory. Madame Raphael longed to dance in a ring. All her life she had looked for a group of people she could hold hands with and dance with in a ring. First she looked for them in the Methodist Church. Her father was a religious fanatic. Then in the Communist Party. Then among the Trotskyites. Then in the anti-abortion movement. A child has a right to life. Then in the pro-abortion movement. A woman has a right to her body. She looked for them among the Marxists, the psychoanalysts and the structuralists. She looked for them in Lenin, Zen Buddhism, Mao Zedong, yogis, the Nouveau Roman, Brechtian theatre, the theatre of panic, and finally she hoped she could at least become one with her students, which meant she always forced them to think and say exactly what she thought and said, and together they formed a single body and a single soul and a single ring and a single dance. I just love that phrase, one with her students, which meant she always forced them to think and say exactly what she thought and said, which bears more than a passing resemblance to universities today. a single soul, a single ring, and a single dance. For Proust, a man's interior universe comprises a miracle, an infinity that never ceases to amaze us. But that is not Kafka's amazement. He does not ask himself what the internal motivations are that determine man's behaviour. He asks a question that is radically different. What possibilities remain for man in a world where the external determinants have become so overpowering that internal impulses no longer carry weight? And in that race toward lightness, we have crossed a fateful boundary. So for me, the key phrase there is, what possibilities remain for man in a world where the external determinants, again, the online world of tribes, have become so overpowering that internal impulses no longer carry weight. If you doubt the notion of external determinants dominating internal impulses, try and take the smartphone off your teenager. And in that race toward lightness, we have crossed a fateful boundary. And this was the actual, in the debate that kicked off me linking all of these online podcasting arguments and tiffs with Milan Kundera, was Douglas Murray at one point referred to an essay Milan Kundera did called Paths in the Fog. And this is what he says in there. Knowing neither the meaning nor the future course of history, knowing not even the objective meaning of their own actions, by which they involuntarily participate in events whose meaning is concealed from them, they proceed through their lives as one proceeds, in the fog. I say fog, not darkness. In the darkness we see nothing. We are blind. We are defenceless. We are not free. In the fog we are free, but it is the freedom of a person in fog. He sees 50 yards ahead of him. He can clearly make out the features of his interlocutor, can take pleasure in the beauty of the trees that line the path, and can even observe what is happening close by and react. Man proceeds in the fog, but when he looks back to judge people of the past, he sees no fog on their path. From his present, which was their faraway future, their path looks perfectly clear to him, good visibility all the way. Looking back, he sees the path. He sees the people proceeding. He sees their mistakes, but not the fog. But for us not to see the fog is to forget what man is, forget what we ourselves are. And I'd just suggest that last sentence is a perfect warning against cancel culture and the idea that because people acted differently in past historical eras, because we see the path from their time to ours as fog-free, what Kundera's saying is we lose a bit of our own humanity when we lose the empathy with previous generations. And again, he argues that reading novels, the wisdom of the novel, is one of the best ways of getting into that forgotten empathy with past peoples. The plot of the joke is itself a joke, and not only its plot, its philosophy as well. Man caught in the trap of a joke suffers a personal catastrophe, which, seen from without, is ludicrous. His tragedy lies in the fact that the joke has deprived him of the right to tragedy. He is condemned to triviality. And this was the point I was making earlier, that unbeknownst to them perhaps, the comedians with millions of followers on YouTube are potentially falling into a joke that ultimately is against themselves. This is where the courtiers of the news event make their mistake. They do not know that the situation's history stages are floodlit only for the first few minutes. No event remains news over its whole duration, merely for quite a brief span of time at the very beginning. The dying children of Somalia, whom millions of spectators used to watch avidly, aren't they dying anymore? What has become of them? Have they grown fatter or thinner? Does Somalia still exist? And in fact, did it ever exist? Could it be only the name of a mirage? When a phenomenon proclaims far in advance its imminent disappearance, many of us know and perhaps even regret it. But when the agony draws to a close, we are already looking elsewhere. The death becomes invisible. It's some time since the river, nightingale, the paths through the fields are passed from man's mind. When nature disappears from the planet tomorrow, who will notice? Where are the great poets now? Have they vanished, or is it only that their voices have grown inaudible? But if man has lost the need for poetry, will he notice when it disappears? The end is not an apocalyptic explosion. There may be nothing so quiet as the end. And in the Olympic Games of my miserable endings, I think that's in contention for at least a silver medal. So I'll just finish with one last image that if this one doesn't finish you off, nothing will. But all the very best until the next time. Goodbye.